There is a kind of silence that only exists in small New England towns in the dead of winter, the kind that settles over a place like a second snowfall, soft and total, smothering everything underneath it. The kind of silence that makes you feel watched, though you cannot say by what. It was that silence that greeted the town of Grantham, New Hampshire, on the morning of February 11, 1993, when the neighbors of Carol Anne Merritt noticed something strange. Her front door stood slightly open. Her car, a 1988 blue Chevrolet Cavalier with a cracked rear bumper, sat untouched in the driveway, its windows laced with frost that had not been scraped. The lights inside the house were off. The wood stove, which Carol kept burning from November through April without exception, had gone cold. Carol Anne Merritt was 34 years old. She was a mother of two. She sang in the Methodist choir every Sunday. She helped organize the town's annual winter carnival, and she made, by all accounts, the finest maple-glazed apple pie that had ever been served at the Grantham Grange Hall potluck supper. She was not a woman who left her door open in February. She was not a woman who let her stove go cold. She was a woman who had simply ceased to be present, without announcement, without explanation, without a single witness who would come forward for over 2 decades. And the question that would linger in Grantham for 31 years, the question that would haunt the people who loved her, and the deputies who searched for her, and the children who grew up without her, was this: who in Carol's own world knew exactly where she had gone and said nothing? Grantham sits in Sullivan County in the western reaches of New Hampshire, tucked between Lake Eastman and the rolling granite hills that flatten into fields of pale winter rye by October. It is the kind of town that does not appear on most maps unless you are already looking for it. The population in 1993 hovered around 3,000. There was a gas station, a general store, a post office that doubled as a community bulletin board, and one diner, Rosie's, where coffee came in ceramic mugs, and the same 12 people sat in the same 12 seats every weekday morning at 7 a.m. The economy in Grantham in 1993 was a modest one. Men worked at the granite quarry outside of town, or drove the 45 minutes to Concord for work in manufacturing. Women often worked in the county school system, at the hospital in Newport, or ran small home businesses, quilting, accounting, childcare. It was not a wealthy town. It was not a desperate one either. It was something in between, the kind of place where people knew one another's business but kept their counsel, where front porches were a form of surveillance, and a handshake still meant something. Carol Anne Merritt, born Carol Ann Holloway in 1958 in Keene, New Hampshire, had moved to Grantham in 1984 when she married Raymond Dale Merritt, a 30-year-old quarry foreman with wide shoulders, a methodical disposition, and deep-set brown eyes that his coworkers said rarely gave much away. Raymond had grown up in Grantham. His father had worked the same quarry. His mother had sung in the same Methodist choir. He was, in every visible way, a rooted man, the kind of man who was supposed to be exactly where he said he was. The couple had 2 children, Daniel, who was 9 years old in February of 1993, and little Elise, who had just turned 6 the previous November. By all outward appearances, the Merritt household was ordinary. A beige colonial at the end of Perch Pond Road, 3/4 of a mile from the lake. A tire swing in the yard that Raymond had hung from the oak tree the summer before. Crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator. A pegboard in the mudroom, where the children's hats and mittens hung in ascending size. The last person to speak with Carol Anne Merritt, according to the early investigation, was her friend and choir companion, Patricia Osgood, 51, who recalled a brief telephone conversation on the evening of February 10, 1993. Patricia would later tell investigators that Carol had seemed tired but not distressed. She had mentioned that she needed to finish mending Elise's winter coat that evening. She said the children were already in bed. She said Raymond was at a card game at Dave Poulin's house out on Route 10. She told me she was going to have a cup of tea and turn in early, Patricia said. That was the last time I heard her voice. Patricia had called again on the morning of the 11th, around 8 a.m., to ask Carol about choir rehearsal times. No one had answered. She assumed Carol was out. It was not until 2:30 in the afternoon, when Patricia drove past Perch Pond Road and noticed the cracked-open door and the unscraped car, that she stopped her Ford pickup at the foot of the driveway and stood there for a moment, watching the house. She said years later that she felt something then, a wrongness she couldn't articulate, like a note played flat, like a sentence that had ended without its final word. She called the Sullivan County Sheriff's Department at 2:47 p.m. Deputy Aaron Kellner was the first responder. He arrived at 3:14 p.m. to find the front door of the Merritt home ajar, not swung wide but cracked open approximately 4 inches, as if someone had left in a hurry or had been pulled away before they could close it properly. The house was cold inside. A ceramic mug of tea sat on the kitchen counter, the tea bag still in it, the liquid never consumed. Carol's coat and boots were still in the mudroom. Her purse sat on the kitchen table, wallet inside, $42 in cash and her New Hampshire driver's license untouched. Daniel and Elise Merritt were not in the home. Raymond Merritt, when located by deputies at approximately 4:30 p.m., stated that he had collected the children from a neighbor, Margaret Shee, who lived 2 houses down early that morning around 7:15 a.m. and taken them to school. He said he had assumed Carol had gone out for a morning walk. He said he had not thought anything of it. He said he had not been concerned. The mug on the counter, the open door, the untouched boots, the car with the frosted, unscraped windows, the $42 and the driver's license and the winter coat, the tea made but never drunk. These were the first stitches in a silence that would hold for over 30 years. Carol Anne Merritt had not gone for a walk. Carol Anne Merritt had simply gone without a single possession that any living person voluntarily leaves behind in February in New Hampshire. And the woods around Grantham, quiet and deep and still with snow, offered no answer whatsoever. By the morning of February 12, 1993, the Sullivan County Sheriff's Department had issued a missing persons report for Carol Anne Merritt, 34, 5'4", brown hair, gray-green eyes, last seen, so far as anyone could determine, sometime between 10 p.m. on February 10th and 7:15 on the morning of the 11th. The window was 9 hours. The temperature the night of February 10th had dropped to 11 degrees below zero. Search teams assembled at the Grantham Town Hall parking lot by 6. Volunteers numbered 63 by the end of the first day. They moved in grids through the birch and hemlock forests between Perch Pond Road and the frozen shoreline of Lake Eastman. State police dogs worked the perimeter of the Merritt property. Searchers wore blaze orange and called her name into the cold air, their voices swallowed immediately by the snow-packed trees. Helicopters belonging to the New Hampshire State Police Air Operations made 3 passes over the county's most remote terrain throughout the afternoon. They found nothing, not a boot print, not a piece of torn fabric caught on a fence, not a single disruption in the undisturbed snowfall that had begun at approximately 10:45 on the night of February 10th and continued, steadily, until 4 in the morning of the 11th, effectively erasing whatever prints or marks the ground beneath might have held. The snow had done its work. News coverage arrived by the 13th. A camera crew from the Manchester station set up at the foot of Perch Pond Road. The Concord Monitor ran a photograph of Carol on the front page of the local section, a smiling photograph from the previous summer's Winter Carnival Committee meeting. She was laughing at something outside the frame, her hair loose, her face open and warm. It was the kind of photograph that makes an absence feel specifically cruel. Clears throat. Those who knew Raymond Merritt said he appeared composed during those early days, perhaps more composed than they might have expected. He answered investigators' questions concisely, without elaboration, without visible distress. He saw to the children's school schedule. He thanked the search volunteers. He spoke briefly to the camera crew on the 14th, standing on his front porch with his hands in his pockets, and said that he was hoping Carol would come home safe. He said it in a flat, even tone, the way a man might read a sentence from a prepared statement. Deputies who were present at those early interviews would later recall, quietly, in the way that investigators speak about things they cannot yet prove, that Raymond Merritt never once used his wife's name. Not Carol, not her, not my wife, just she, just her. The pronoun at a remove, as though he were describing a situation rather than a person. Investigators examined Raymond's account of his whereabouts on the night of February 10th. He stated he had been at Dave Poulin's house for a card game from approximately 7 p.m. until midnight. Dave Poulin and two other men, Gary Estes and Ron Bellamy, confirmed Raymond had been present. The game had ended just before midnight, and Raymond said he had driven straight home on Route 10. Arriving by 12:20 a.m., he said Carol had been asleep. He said he had not wanted to wake her. The drive from Dave Poulin's house on Route 10 to the Merritt home on Perch Pond Road was, at most, 11 minutes. Raymond's odometer reading, checked by deputies on the morning of the 12th, showed 7.4 miles logged since his last noted fill-up at the Grantham Sunoco on February 9th. The distance from his home to Poulin's house and back was 5.6 miles. The remaining 1.8 miles were unaccounted for in Raymond's stated route. It was a small number, a minor discrepancy. The kind of thing that could be explained by a wrong turn, a detour, a stop at the road's edge to look at the stars. Investigators noted it. They noted it quietly, and they kept moving. The forensic sweep of the Merritt home conducted on February 12th and 13th revealed limited physical evidence. There were no signs of forced entry. There were no signs of a physical struggle inside the home. The tea mug was swabbed and processed. A faint disruption in the snow on the south side of the house, partially filled in by the overnight snowfall, was documented by Deputy Kellner in his field notes as possible drag trace, indeterminate, approximately 6 feet in length, direction unclear. The state medical examiner, Dr. Leonard Haynes, noted in a consultation with investigators on February 16th that the open door and the absence of outerwear in 11 below temperatures suggested either that Carol had left the house involuntarily or that she had been removed after becoming unresponsive. He stated the latter scenario was, in his professional estimation, consistent with the evidence available. Those words, removed after becoming unresponsive, sat in the case file like a stone in still water, sending rings outward through the investigation, but the rings could reach no shore. There was no body. There was no definitive evidence. There was only absence, and absence is not prosecutable. By April of 1993, the active search had been officially suspended. The case file, 211 pages by that point, including witness interviews, forensic reports, and timeline documentation, was transferred to the New Hampshire State Police Major Crime Unit, which assigned it a case number and set it on a shelf in the cold case repository in Concord. There was one other detail that lodged itself, like a splinter, in the notes of investigators who worked the case in those early months. A hardware store receipt, found in the kitchen drawer of the Merritt home during the initial forensic sweep, dated February 9, 1993, just one day before Carol was last seen. It listed a roll of heavy-gauge construction poly sheeting, 2 boxes of finishing nails, and a gallon of wood sealant. Raymond Merritt had paid in cash. The hardware store owner, when interviewed, remembered the purchase. He remembered it because Raymond had come in early, before most customers, and had not said much. He said Raymond had been deliberate about the selection, picking the heavier gauge sheeting when a lighter roll would have served most household patching purposes. The store owner had thought nothing of it at the time. He had thought nothing of it for 26 years, in the way that perfectly ordinary facts remain perfectly ordinary, until the moment a context arrives that gives them an entirely different shape. Raymond Merritt was not charged. He was not named a suspect publicly. He remained in Grantham, in the Colonial on Perch Pond Road, with the tire swing still hanging from the oak tree in the yard. The file said. The town went quiet. And the question that no one could yet answer, the question that Patricia Osgood would wake to every morning for the next 27 years, was how a woman leaves her coat, her boots, her purse, her car, and her children in 11-degree weather, and simply is no longer anywhere in the world that anyone can find her. Time moves differently in a case that has no resolution. For those who have ever held a suspicion they could not prove, who have ever stood at the edge of a truth they could see the shape of but not the face, the years do not pass so much as accumulate layer upon layer, like those winter snowfalls, each one smoothing the surface while the irregularities beneath remain intact, frozen, waiting. By the summer of 1993, Raymond Merritt had enrolled Daniel and Elise in the Grantham summer recreation program. He had taken on additional hours at the quarry. Neighbors described him as functioning, as present, as managing. Margaret Shee, who had watched the children the morning of February 11th, said that Raymond had brought her a casserole dish back one evening in June, washed and dried, with a brief thank you note tucked under the lid. She said the handwriting was neat. She said it unsettled her in a way she could not fully explain. In September of 1993, Raymond filed for legal presumption of Carol's departure, not a declaration of death, but a legal instrument that formalized her absence from the household for custodial and financial purposes. It was a procedural step. It was also, to those in town who had watched and wondered, a kind of punctuation on a sentence that had never been completed. Daniel Merritt, 9 years old in February of 1993, grew quiet through the following years. His teachers noted in reports from the 4th and 5th grades that he was withdrawn, that he was attentive in class but disengaged during free time, that he preferred reading alone to play. He had begun, sometime in the 3rd grade, drawing the same image repeatedly in the margins of his schoolwork, a figure standing at an open door in winter, seen from behind, facing outside. One teacher, Mrs. Boulanger, mentioned it to a school counselor. The counselor made a note. The note went into a school file that no one ever cross-referenced with the police case file. Elise Merritt reported, years later, when she was old enough to report it at all, that she had nightmares from an early age about cold air and doors that wouldn't close. She said she had never told her father about the nightmares because she had learned early that certain things in the house were not discussed. She said the house on Perch Pond Road always smelled, to her, like something waiting to be said. Clears throat. For those who have ever doubted someone they love, who have felt a creeping wrongness in the ordinary facts of a person's behavior, who have constructed, against their will, a story that explains the wrong notes and the misaligned details and the absence of grief where grief should live. The particular anguish of the Merritt family's years is not difficult to recognize, even from the outside. Raymond Merritt did not relocate. He did not pursue other relationships, at least not openly, for several years. He continued to work at the quarry. He continued to attend the Methodist church, though he sat in the back pew now and left immediately after the service ended and never once looked at the choir. He said, on the 2 occasions over the following decade when a local journalist revisited the story, that he hoped someday there would be answers. His hands were steady when he said it. His voice did not break. By 2001, Daniel Merritt was 17 and had begun to speak differently about his mother's disappearance. He told a high school friend, a young man named Kyle Perrault, that he had a memory from the night of February 10, 1993, that he had never told anyone. He said that he was not certain the memory was real. He said he had been 9 years old and it was late and he had been half asleep. But he said he remembered hearing sounds from downstairs, voices, not arguing exactly, but urgent, a door, cold air, and then a long silence that felt different from ordinary nighttime quiet. Kyle Perrault held that conversation in his memory for 4 years. He did not know what to do with it. He was not certain Daniel would want him to do anything with it. He was a teenager, and the man Daniel was speaking about was Daniel's father, and certain things in Grantham were still not discussed. Raymond Merritt left Grantham in the fall of 2003. He retired from the quarry. He was 49 years old, which struck many in town as early, though he had a modest pension and the house on Perch Pond Road had been paid off for years. He sold the property in November of 2003 and moved to the southern part of the state, to a small apartment in Nashua, and faded from the daily consciousness of a town that had spent 10 years watching him from a careful distance. The tire swing came down with the new owners. The crayon drawings were gone long before. The case file in Concord remained on its shelf. Investigator after investigator cycled through the major crime unit. Each one opened the file, read the 211 pages, noted the 1.8 unaccounted miles, noted the drag trace, noted the composure and the absent name, and each one closed the file again, because 211 pages of careful observation and no body and no weapon and no witness is not a case. It is a portrait of a suspicion that has no place to land. The swing had hung still for a decade. The house on Perch Pond Road changed hands twice more, and somewhere in Nashua, Raymond Dale Merritt went about his days. The case file of Carol Anne Merritt came before the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit in March of 2019, as part of a systematic review of Sullivan County homicides and missing persons cases from the 1990s. The Cold Case Unit, formally established under the New Hampshire Department of Justice, had, by 2019, developed a refined protocol for revisiting cases in which no body had been recovered. A combination of digital forensic mapping, genealogical DNA cross-referencing, and structured re-interviews of witnesses who had aged into different relationships with information they had once protected or suppressed. Senior investigator Thomas Beauchamp, who led the cold case review, noted in his intake memorandum for the Merritt file that several elements had struck him immediately. He wrote, "Timeline inconsistency at odometer level consistent with a secondary location. No outerwear departure in sub-zero conditions inconsistent with voluntary exit. Drag trace documented but never forensically pursued to conclusion. Subject's behavioral profile during initial investigation, period atypical for intimate partner grief response." Beauchamp requested a full geodetic survey of the terrain within a 2-mile radius of the Merritt property on Perch Pond Road, a survey that employed ground-penetrating radar technology that had not existed in 1993. The survey was conducted over 4 days in June of 2019 in the birch forest to the south and east of the old Merritt property. On June 19, 2019, at approximately 11:20 in the morning, the radar returned an anomaly. Clear's Throat. It was located 1,140 feet into the woods southeast of the former Merritt property line, in a shallow depression between two large granite outcroppings that would have been easily accessible in winter from the south side of the house, the side where Deputy Kellner had documented the partial drag trace 26 years earlier. The anomaly was consistent, in size and density, with human remains. Excavation was authorized under a judicial warrant issued June 21st. On June 24, 2019, the remains of Carol Anne Merritt were recovered from the location identified by the radar survey. She had been wrapped in a length of plastic sheeting, a brand of construction-grade poly sheeting that had been available at the Grantham hardware store in the early 1990s, and placed in the depression at sufficient depth to survive frost cycles and wildlife disturbance, but shallow enough to have been carried by one person without assistance. The state medical examiner's office confirmed identification through dental records on July 1, 2019. The cause of death was determined, as much as the condition of the remains allowed, to be consistent with blunt force trauma to the posterior cranium. Carol Anne Merritt had been in those woods for 26 years. She had been less than a quarter mile from her own home. She had lain in the dark beneath the granite and the birch roots while the seasons moved over her, while her children grew up without answers, while a town buried its questions in everyday conversation and winter carnivals and Sunday hymns. It was at this point that Kyle Perrell, now 35 years old and living in Vermont, came forward. He contacted the Cold Case Unit in July of 2019, 2 weeks after Carol's identification was made public by the New Hampshire Department of Justice. He explained that he had carried a piece of information for 18 years and had not known, for most of that time, whether it was his to give. He told investigator Beauchamp what Daniel Merritt had told him in 2001. The sounds from downstairs, the voices, the cold air, the particular quality of the silence that had followed. He gave his account in a signed statement that was entered into the renewed investigation record on July 22, 2019. Investigator Beauchamp reached out to Daniel Merritt directly in August of 2019. Daniel was 35 years old. He lived in Claremont, New Hampshire, approximately 35 miles from the town where he had grown up. He had not spoken to his father in several years. Daniel Merritt sat with investigator Beauchamp for 4 hours on August 14, 2019, in a conference room at the Sullivan County Sheriff's Department, the same department that had taken Patricia Osgood's call on February 11, 1993. He confirmed what he had told Kyle Perrell. He said the memory had never left him. He said he had spent decades constructing reasons why it wasn't what it seemed, because it was his father, and because he was 9, and because no one in the house had ever acknowledged that anything had happened. He said it was like having a word on the tip of your tongue for 30 years, something real and present and fully formed that you simply could not make your mouth say. I heard him go out, Daniel told the investigator. It was cold. The door was open for a while. When I woke up the next morning, she wasn't there, and he told me she had left. And I knew that wasn't true. I just didn't know yet what the truth was. He said it quietly, without drama, in the way that people speak when they have waited a very long time to say something and have, in the waiting, stripped it down to its essential form. Elise Merritt was contacted the following week. She was 32 years old. She lived in Portland, Maine. She had not spoken to Raymond since 2011. She said that she had spent her adult life in a low, constant state of certainty that something was very wrong and a high, constant state of fear about what it would mean to find out that she was right. She said, "I kept waiting for someone to come find us. I kept thinking we would be found eventually." A pause. "Then, I meant me and Danny. I meant that someone would find us and help us say it." The New Hampshire State Police Major Crime Unit, in coordination with the Cold Case Unit, located Raymond Dale Merritt at a residential address in Nashua, New Hampshire, on September 3, 2019. He was 65 years old. He had lived quietly in the same apartment for 16 years. His neighbors described him as keeping to himself, a polite, unremarkable, reliably present but rarely engaged. At 9:47 in the morning on September 3, 2019, Raymond Dale Merritt was placed under arrest at the entrance to his apartment building on Broad Street in Nashua. He was wearing a gray jacket and carrying a small canvas grocery bag. Investigators reported that he did not speak at the moment of the arrest. He stood very still, his face composed, and allowed the handcuffs to be applied without resistance. He did not ask any questions. He did not express surprise. He simply stood there, still and steady, exactly as those who had known him in Grantham had always described him. The expression, witnesses noted, was one they recognized. A man who had been waiting, somewhere in the back of his own mind, for a knock that had been 26 years in coming. News of the arrest broke in New Hampshire media by noon on September 3rd. By evening, it had reached the wire services. By the following morning, Grantham, population barely more than 3,000, was the subject of national news coverage for the first time since that February morning in 1993, when a door had been found standing open, and a woman had not been there to explain it. The reaction in the town was not a single thing. It was layered and contradictory, the way reactions always are in places where a wound has had decades to calcify. Patricia Osgood, then 77 years old and still living in Sullivan County, was reached by a reporter from the Concord Monitor on the afternoon of September 3rd. She did not speak for a long moment when told of the arrest. Then she said, "I knew. I always knew. And I spent 26 years being angry at myself for knowing and not being able to do anything about it. And now she's been found. That matters. That matters more than I can say." Others in the community spoke of disbelief. Not that Raymond had been arrested, but that 31 years of proximity, of shared church services and volunteer days, and the careful management of a town's collective knowledge, had led here. There were people who had sat across the road from Raymond at Tuesday evening church dinners for a decade after Carol's disappearance. There were people who had passed him at the hardware store and asked how the children were getting on. There were people who had looked him directly in the eyes and chosen not to see what they saw there, because the alternative was too large and too close, and too, entirely without precedent in their ordinary lives. For those who have ever watched someone closely for a long time and wondered what they were watching, the particular grief of a community that has harbored a secret it didn't fully know it was keeping is not easy to describe. It is something like guilt. It is something like relief. It is something like the sensation of a knot in the chest that you have held for so long you had forgotten it was a knot, and had started to think it was simply the shape of your own heart. Raymond Dale Merritt was indicted on a charge of first-degree homicide on September 17, 2019, in Sullivan County Superior Court. He entered no plea at the initial arraignment and stood with his hands folded in front of him at the defense table, looking at the wall above the judge's bench with that same composed, inscrutable expression that everyone from Grantham recognized, and that no one had ever been able to translate into the language of guilt until now. His attorney entered a not guilty plea on his behalf. The trial began in March of 2021, delayed by 18 months due to the national health emergency. The courtroom in Newport, a spare, clean room with pine-paneled walls and tall windows looking out on a snow-covered town square, was filled to capacity on the first day. Patricia Osgood sat in the third row. Daniel Merritt sat 2 rows behind her, wearing a dark suit. He held a small, framed photograph of his mother in his jacket pocket and did not take it out during the proceedings, but he touched the outline of it through the fabric at intervals throughout the day. The forensic evidence was meticulous. The ground-penetrating radar documentation, the dental record identification, the plastic sheeting, traced by investigators to a lot number consistent with a product sold in Sullivan County in the early 1990s. The testimony of the state's forensic anthropologist, who described the injury pattern to the remains as consistent with a single, decisive impact. The fiber analysis from the sheeting, which revealed trace material consistent with soil from the south side of the former Merritt property. Then there was the odometer. Investigator Beauchamp presented the original field notes from Deputy Kellner's February 1993 interview with Raymond. The 7.4 miles logged, the 5.6-mile verified route, the 1.8-mile discrepancy. With the geodetic survey data now established, Beauchamp demonstrated that a drive from the Merritt home into the woods via the old fire road off Perch Pond Road and back added approximately 1.7 miles to the odometer. The margin was 0.1 miles, a rounding error, the width of a shadow. The prosecution's closing argument was delivered on March 22, 2021, by Assistant Attorney General Renata Bloom. She said, "Carol Anne Merritt never left that house. She was in those woods, 1,140 feet from her own front door from the night of February 10, 1993 until the day we found her. Her children grew up, her friends grew old, her town moved on, and she stayed. She stayed because she had no choice. And it is our obligation to her, to that woman who made apple pies and sang in the choir and raised her children and put the kettle on, to say, plainly and clearly and for the record, she deserves the truth told about what was done to her." The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. On March 25, 2021, Raymond Dale Merritt was found guilty of first-degree homicide in the death of Carol Anne Merritt. He was sentenced on April 9, 2021, to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He said nothing at sentencing. He stood, he sat, he was taken from the courtroom. Daniel Merritt delivered a victim impact statement before the sentence was passed. He stood at the podium with the small framed photograph finally in his hand, a photograph from the summer of 1992, his mother laughing in the backyard, Elise on her hip and the oak tree visible in the corner of the frame, the tire swing still unhung. He said, "She was 34 years old. She had plans for the weekend. She was mending a coat. She made tea. She deserved to drink it." He sat down. The courtroom was very quiet. There are 31 years between the February morning, when Patricia Osgood stood at the foot of a driveway in 11-degree cold and felt something wrong she could not name, and the March afternoon when a jury of 12 people in Sullivan County gave that wrongness its rightful name. 31 years is a long time to carry a question. It is long enough for children to become adults, for adults to become old, for a town to fold a mystery into its daily life like a stone into mortar, present in the structure, invisible in the surface. The Carol Anne Merritt case did not make national headlines in 1993. It was a local story, a missing woman in a small New England town, and then it was a cold file in a metal cabinet in Concord, and then it was a geodetic survey in a birch forest, and then it was a verdict. What it was, at every stage, was unfinished. And the particular lesson of cases like this one, of cases in which the answer was always present, always nearby, always 1,140 feet from the front door, is that the unfinished do not rest until they are complete. The children who watched from the margins of a silence that was not theirs to break finally spoke. The technology that did not exist in 1993 was developed and deployed. The investigators who inherited a file of 211 pages refused to let the number stop growing. And Carol Anne Merritt, who sang in the choir and made apple pies and put the kettle on a February night 31 years ago, was found and named and brought into the record where she had always belonged. She was here, she mattered. She was not forgotten even when it felt that way. And the truth, however long it takes, has a way of surviving everything that tries to bury it. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard. This documentary script is a narrative work inspired by documented cold case patterns in New Hampshire and the investigative methods of the NH Cold Case Unit. Character names, specific locations, and identifying details are composite and dramatized for narrative purposes. The investigation methods, forensic technologies, and procedural elements are accurate representations of real practices used in cold case investigations.